Welcome everyone, this is On Just Restart, and this time we're talking about why The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom could be running at 60 frames per second, potentially on new hardware from Nintendo next year. So firstly, let's talk about this possibility of it running on base Switch, because we don't know what's going to happen exactly. This is a theory speculation video, but when you take into consideration that initially Breath of the Wild was made for the Wii U and then ported over to Switch relatively last minute, it's possible that they can get a better running, better looking version on the Switch if it was built ground up for that, and that's what Tears of the Kingdom would be. This has had the longest development time for any Zelda ever. So if they're going to be getting anything out of the Switch that would be surprising, this would be the time to do it. With that all said, it's pretty uncommon to see open world games be running at 60 frames per second. There's a lot to load and stream in there. It's not necessarily a reasonable expectation, especially for dated hardware like the Switch. But for the sake of conversation, I'm not going to rule it out entirely, but also a lot of this discussion is going to be centered around a new piece of hardware we could be seeing from Nintendo next year. And I know a lot of people really don't like this idea of new hardware coming out next year, but the fact of the matter is Nintendo came out with a system in 2017, then 2019, then 2021, and 2023 would fit the pattern for new hardware, and historically speaking, Nintendo has usually put out new hardware alongside a big brand new Zelda. This Zelda has had the longest development history in Zelda history, so it seems unlikely that they would skip this game. Even if it doesn't come out day and date with the game, that this new system, it's likely not going to be too far off either, within a year or so. So there's probably going to be some sort of updated version for Tears of the Kingdom whenever the system does come out. So the ultimate point to be made here is that there's going to be a better looking, better running version of Tears of the Kingdom for a new Nintendo system. I think this part is really likely. But just because we assume that there will be a better running version of Tears of the Kingdom for a new Nintendo Switch hardware, and also if we assume that they're going to get better results out of the base Switch with Tears of the Kingdom compared to Breath of the Wild, that doesn't mean that either version is going to run at 60 frames per second, because the fact of the matter is, it's hard to get 60 frames per second out of an open world game. Yes. But I do think there are some signs suggesting that this could be the direction we're headed in. And I think the biggest point to be made here is that we're starting to see Nintendo more frequently dip into 60 frames per second for other Zelda games. So yes, on the Switch, Breath of the Wild came out, not a 60 frames per second game, but before that was A Link Between Worlds. And what's interesting about A Link Between Worlds, both A Link Between Worlds and Breath of the Wild were being developed alongside of each other, and there were different considerations that were being made. This was a time where the Zelda team was really talking about focusing on breaking down the foundations of what a Zelda game could be, and that's why they started changing things around and remixing it. Which is why we saw that we could do dungeons out of order in A Link Between Worlds, and also in Breath of the Wild. And interestingly, with A Link Between Worlds, we did see the game was running at 60 frames per second. Even though it was a top-down Zelda, it was still a game that pushed visuals on the 3DS. However, the game's director, Hiromasa Shikata, had this to say on the matter. It's really the concept of the game that changes whether you want to keep the volume of information in the game low and running at 60 frames per second. We kept it at 60 to make the 3D look smooth, allow the players to clearly see enemy movements, and keep everything moving crisply, as with previous games. This doesn't mean that all future Zelda titles will run at 60 frames per second. And I think there's a few valuable points to take from this. Firstly, as he says, this doesn't mean that all future Zelda titles will run at 60 frames per second, and sure enough, that held true because Breath of the Wild came out a few years later and was not running at 60 frames per second. But one is a top-down Zelda for a handheld system, and then the other was an open-world game in HD. So two very different situations. But the other point I want to harp on here is the reasoning behind why they went with 60 FPS. It was to make the 3D look smooth and allow the players to clearly see enemy movements and keep everything moving crisply. But let's go beyond the 3DS and talk about other Zelda games on the Switch. So with Link's Awakening Remake, that game is running at 60 frames per second, and that is an HD top-down Zelda. Still not an open world game, but they got it running at 60 frames per second, or that was their target. So clearly we're starting to see a pattern of games running at 60 frames per second with the Zelda series. And then after that, we got Skyward Sword HD, and guess what? That game also running at 60 frames per second. And this is a 3D Zelda, so They're clearly upping the ante here when it comes to performance in Zelda games. The initial Skyward Sword did not run at 60 frames per second, and with the HD remasters for both Twilight Princess and Wind Waker, they didn't bother to put those games at 60 frames per second either. They probably could have, but that wasn't their goal. Yet they did it with Skyward Sword HD. Why? Well, you could make the argument that the reason they did this is because it was a simple way to add an improvement to the game to make it seem more valuable, even though they weren't remastering it or reworking it as much compared to the other HD remasters. That's an argument that could be made. It's something that I think it's kind of hard to confirm one way or the other, but definitely something that I think some people will align with. But I think the reason they went for 60 frames per second is because, well, it made sense for the gameplay. Using motion controls to do the actual combat with higher FPS makes it feel smoother. 60 frames per second makes sense with games that are fast-paced and there's a lot of action involved, which is why you typically always see 60 frames per second with fighting games, because it's always about those very quick reaction times. And for Skyward Sword, that makes a lot of sense because it's a very combat-focused Zelda game. Which brings me to Tears of the Kingdom. We've seen patents of different animations that they're putting in for sky combat. From the little evidence we've seen so far, it does seem to be the case that they are making efforts to improve the combat in Tears of the Kingdom. And looking at the combat options in Breath of the Wild, while there were a lot of different things you could do because of the physics system, the different abilities you had, in terms of actual sword combat, it was fairly limited compared to previous Zelda games, and I do think this is something they're going to be improving upon. So with this potential emphasis on building on the combat from Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, the question of could the game run at 60 frames per second comes to mind. Maybe it makes more sense to do that for a more combat-focused Zelda game. And I think most people would agree that 60 frames per second would obviously be better, but only if they could get it running well. And that's the real question here, could this happen? On the base Switch, this is definitely a huge question mark. They struggled to get to a smooth 30 frames per second with Breath of the Wild, but Breath of the Wild wasn't built ground up for the Switch, it was built ground up for the Wii U. So what happens when they build a game ground up for the Switch and they spend over 6 years in development? They're going to have a game that's going to run and look a lot better. There's a lot of graphical techniques that they've come up with they're now implementing now that they were not implementing back in 2017. We've seen a lot of Nintendo games get a lot sharper, we've seen performance improve, there are different effects involved, but those are all with smaller Nintendo games. The Zelda team is the team that's known to push Nintendo hardware beyond what we thought was reasonable or expected. No one expected Nintendo to put out Tears of the Kingdom running at 60 frames per second on the Switch, but if there's any team that could do it, it would be the Zelda team. And I also feel it should be noted that while Super Mario Odyssey is not an open world game, it does have large open-ish areas and the game is running at 60 frames per second and it's pretty detailed as well. So 60 FPS Tears of the Kingdom would absolutely be more demanding than a Mario Odyssey, but I'm simply saying that it's not entirely out of the question for me. I am still skeptical, I still doubt it, but I definitely think it's within the smallest realm of possibility. But what I think is a far more reasonable expectation is for this kind of improvement happening on the next Nintendo system. Be it a Switch Pro, a Switch Plus, a Switch 2, whatever you want to call it, something new is going to come out sooner or later, and they're going to want a better version of Tears of the Kingdom running on that system. And hypothetically speaking, as many are speculating right now, what if Tears of the Kingdom launches alongside this new system? If this is the case, yes, Tears of the Kingdom will still be available for the Switch, it'll probably still run fine, but they're going to want to have a version that looks and runs better. Something that's going to make people want to move on to the next system. So what's a way that they could get Tears of the Kingdom to seem really appealing to buy alongside a new system? Well, the game running at a higher resolution with less pop-in, better draw distance, and a better frame rate. If Nintendo can tout that Tears of the Kingdom runs at 60 frames per second in 4K, an open world game, that's definitely something that will help them sell the next system. Now, before those in the comments would jump at me and say there's no way the system could run at 4K, well, if you haven't heard of DLSS, which is basically just this upscaling technology, it would be an upscale to 4K, it wouldn't be a true 4K, but the game would look substantially better than a 1080p, or in the case of Breath of the Wild and the Switch, a 900p image. But anyway, that's the basic theory. There are Zelda games on the Switch that are running at 60 frames per second. If Nintendo's going to be pushing Tears of the Kingdom with new hardware, they're going to want to really push that system and showcase why it makes sense to upgrade, and having that game run at 60 frames per second, a version of Zelda that may have more of an emphasis on combat compared to its predecessor, it may make a lot of sense, and I think a lot of people would be excited about it. But what do you guys think? Do you guys think this could happen? Do you think there's a possibility we could see a Tears of the Kingdom running at 60 frames per second? Let me know in the comments below. Anyways, everyone, this is On Just Restart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.